Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of Sean's Old School Movie Podcast. I am Mike Stopford, and I'm here as always with Sean Whiteman.
Hello.
And today we're going to let Sean do the majority of the talking because we're delving into something that's way out of my expertise. So I'm going to be learning just as much as the rest of you today. Today we bring you
Bond. James Bond.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
Bond. James Bond.
Bond. James Bond.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
So, like we said earlier, we are talking today about James Bond. So, I don't know a whole lot. I've seen some of the movies. I haven't seen them all. Can't even really tell you if I've seen any of them more than once.
No.
But just to educate me and everybody else, what is James Bond and where did it come from?
First, before I answer your question, just to let everybody know, there could be quite a few spoiler alerts throughout this. That's number one. And there is possibly going to be a lot of jumping back and forth. So, from different films to different films. If James Bond, a lot of people have different variations of where the character of James Bond came from. Ian Fleming, basically the books were kind of just created, and the stories were created from kinds of things back in his days, of things that he had read up on, or possibly experiences through history, growing up, kinds of things like that, and kind of created this James Bond character kind of around that.
When was that? Like, when did he write the books?
The books were started written out in early 50s to mid 50s. There was...
And Bond started in the 60s, correct?
Bond started in the 60s.
Okay.
So the books, there's 13 books. Some of the stories are short stories, so quite a few of the stories are collaborated into one book. And they were just turned into films, obviously having to create other things along the way to make an actual full-length film out of it. Bond, the original James Bond film, Dr. No, debuted on October the 5th, 1962, in England, and around most parts of the world that it was brought to at the time. Now, funny things about Bond was bringing the Bond character to life, because Bond movies are a product of their time. I'm going to say that again. They're products of their time and things that were going on. So in the 60s, the spy era was becoming big. And that was, later on, we started seeing shows like Get Smart, The Avengers, which was another BBC program, kind of spy program.
And that had a lot to do with the Cold War, because coming out of World War II, basically the U.S. and Russia allied against each other. This idea of democracy versus communism, and both countries were spying on each other. And when you read in the history, there was a lot of cool gadgets and cool things used to spy on people, and a lot of it was things that people kind of made up, almost science fiction-y. You know, what they were able to do, but this was the time this is when satellites were first, being launched and being used to spy on people and stuff like that. So
which is a good big concept, because that's basically what Dr. No focuses around. So Dr. No is using satellites to veer American missiles off course, using a radar more or less in this huge kind of plant that he's created, and
which at the time would have been cutting edge, like
very much so cutting edge.
Like you're watching a spy film about these satellites, but at the same time, your government and their government are launching satellites that you're not 100% sure what they do.
No, absolutely
or what
not.
they're capable of.
And whether or not some of the things that they talk about or the missions that they bring up, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not a scientist in any way, shape, or form. But I mean, I'm sure, considering how realistic we kind of want to make Bond and the things that he's kind of doing, I would have to assume that at first a lot of the things, kind of missions that he goes on, like kinds of things like this, were actually kinds of things that maybe could have been done, or things that were talked about that kind of just gave names to in some way, shape, or form.
There were spies.
Absolutely.
Working for both
Black Ops spies, things that still had to do with the military, still actually in those days and times. And governments kind of use spies, like Bond movies when they first kind of started out, especially Dr. No and From Russia with Love, were great spy espionage stories. There's action for people that kind of wanted it, especially for the very early 60s, and again being products of their time. So again, 60s being the spy era, there's action, but still a little bit more sleuthy, spying kind of stuff.
No, I mean, it wasn't a Michael Bay film.
No.
With explosions and gunfire and lasers.
There's explosions, but we're not talking explosions like every scene, gunfights every scene. Like the occasional person might have to get killed, or people trying to eliminate Bond, of course, because we can't have him solving our plans for world domination or whatever there may possibly be. The first Bond film, which again, if we're going to go back to 1962, was made on a budget of just over $1 million, which is quite a substantial chunk of change at that time. And also, as much as most people out there who are Bond fans, whoever your favorite Bond may be, most people will pick Sean Connery. And he was actually not Ian Fleming's first choice. He did actually not like Sean Connery.
Ian Fleming was the author of the Bond books.
The author of the Bond books.
I don't remember if you said his name in the beginning.
But yeah, possibly not. But yes, Ian Fleming was the author of the Bond books, and he would visit the sets at the time because he wanted to see how his books were being brought to life. And
he was really hands-on about it.
He was very hands-on about it, and he met Sean Connery, and he said to the producers, like, this guy doesn't really fit the character of James Bond. He doesn't fit what I'm looking for as a James Bond. James Bond, the movies and the books are two completely different things. In the books, Bond is very rough edge. Like, he's very sometimes kill first, ask questions later. Not the smooth, suave, debonair gentleman that we are used to seeing in the early 60s, 70s.
And that was a theme through all the Bonds, is that he was, a gentleman.
He was a gentleman spy.
Yeah.
Which was what he was.
So that was nothing like the character in the books then.
No, absolutely not. The books were actually, considering the time that they were written, were a little bit more edgy than the films were. And action had to be kept to a limitation. So if there was a fight, like 10 seconds maybe it would last for, we started falling into that era with one punch you're dead, one punch you're dead, one punch you're dead. Don't know how that's possible, but it was also possible that Bond never wrinkled up his tuxedo or messed up his hair. But
so definitely not a Jason Statham film.
No, absolutely not in any way, shape, or form. But Dr. No, and this is funny considering the history of James Bond. Dr. No, when it was finished and debuted in the theaters on October the 5th, when the film was all said and done, the producers looked at one another. Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman looked at one another and they said, "This sucks. This film sucks." And 55 years later now, which we're pretty much up to, 55, 56 years later, Bond is the longest running movie franchise known to man out there. And Dr. No, when I watch it, it is actually one of my favorites. It brings the Bond character to life, and we also get to see another very important concept of Bond movies, which is the very first ever Bond girl, who was played by Ursula Andress, who at the time was a Swedish model still, but maybe a little bit of acting experience here and there, but definitely modeling. Very attractive woman, and we don't see her until halfway into the film, and she comes walking out of the ocean in, at the time, quite revealing bikini, very showing, with a nice knife stuck at the side, so it gave her kind of this, had a very sexy, just very sex appeal concept to it, and her personification of first seeing of a Bond woman, her, this white bikini and her and so forth, has been parodied multiple times in different shows, different movies, cartoons, different things like that. So her character's name was Honey Rider, which was quite normal at the time. Bond girls would start having a history more or less later on as time progressed. But the film flows along at a nice pace, and we get, again, as I said, good character introductions and introductions to James Bond, and also other things like organizations, evil organizations that we would hear about later on throughout the 60s, and Sean Connery films as well, more or less.
So it was a really good setup to introduce you to not just the character of James Bond, but what the movies were going to be.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, so they did the first one, Dr. No.
Yeah.
They kind of established Bond. They introduced everyone to this character, and you said that was 1962?
62.
So how long until they did the second Bond movie?
Second Bond movie was 1 year later. Dr. No actually had quite a good pickup. Rough estimate, as I'm not totally up to par on numbers, but Dr. No, for the $1 million it cost to make, brought in $59 million in a worldwide box office.
So even though the producers and stuff thought it sucked,
It
made enough money that it was like, let's do a sequel.
Obviously, again, $59 million does not sound like a lot. Most movies today cost twice as much as that to make. But again, put yourself back in 1962 and think about bringing to life a character and taking a chance, and we just made under $60 million on this guy for a $1 million budget film.
Sounds sequel worthy to me.
So the fan basis was obviously there, and the fans obviously screamed for more. So From Russia with Love was the next to come out. Now keep in mind, the Bond movies also did not come out in the order that the books were written. Mm-hmm. We just picked ones that sounded like good to start out with, and we'll keep going as things progress. From Russia with Love, much, much better, and it is considered out of the series as probably the most popular of the Bond films. It is a fantastic espionage story of having to kind of play a little bit of a game, kind of like falling into a trap to get a Lecter decoding machine that can help the English or other countries to be able to decode certain spy messages and so forth, military messages. And it's a fantastic espionage story of the Russians defecting to Spectre, which this is Bond's second encounter with Spectres. Dr. No was his first encounter with Spectre. And Spectre is the name, of course, of the main evil organization that these big top bad guys work for. So there's defection, there's the Russians, there's the Cold War story kind of building up a little bit better, and of course Bond caught right in the middle.
And those coded messages that you were talking about with that coding machine, that is something based out of history, because even though I haven't watched a lot of Bond, I do watch a lot of the History Channel
Right.
on a Saturday afternoon when I got nothing else to do. And there was a company that made these coding machines to make coded messages.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
for the first while, the U.S. were getting all of they were cracking all of Russia's messages, or the Soviet Union, I guess, at the time. And the reason for that was that somebody in the U.S. government had paid a bunch of money to I think they were Swiss manufacturers of this machine, to basically give the U.S. a way to break the codes. So the U.S. would intercept all these messages from Russia and crack the codes, but the messages that Russia intercepted from the U.S. they couldn't, because they had different lines of code. And I think the Russian machines had 4 lines, and the U.S. were using ones that had 16 lines,
Right.
and they didn't have decoder things. So that, at the time, was very relevant when they were doing the films. Like, it was something that was actually happening. I don't think it was mainstream news back then, but it was something that was actually happening.
They were things that were actually happening. That's kind of things that I, myself personally, I would look at as a lot of black bag, black ops kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the secret messages, of course, that only certain people would be able to see. Again, though, as I said, Bond films are a product of their time, and I think, as you pointed out, that this one also, again, like you said, was focusing on things that were now becoming kind of going on, and it's kind of like saying, like, what would it be like if James Bond had to deal with this situation? Like, kind of maybe like what we've talked about before, Rambo movies were kind of the same thing. Rambo movies were products of their time as well, and each Rambo film dealt with something that was going on in the world at the time. It's just like saying, though, what would the situation be like if Rambo had to deal with it? What would he do? Well, same kind of deal here. What would Bond do? What would Bond have to do?
You know what movie they never made? How Chuck Norris would deal with the Taliban.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I think he would just come in and just fuck their shit all up.
I think he would just walk up and they'd surrender if they were smart.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Kind of skipping ahead, From Russia with Love pulled in even better numbers at the box office and really jumped ahead. Bond, by this due point in time, had really picked up its history, but Bond would not actually hit the mark. And this may sound cliche, boys and girls, but third time is totally a charm. And bringing in a different director and bringing in a little bit of a different concept of Bond now that the Bond character has kind of been a little bit created and stuff like that. And we can maybe jump ahead now to a little bit harder situations, and we'll kind of veer out of the Cold War for a little bit, and we will bring apart Goldfinger, which is the quintessential James Bond film in every way, shape, or form. Now, From Russia with Love did good in some way, shape, or form and started introducing us to gadgets. That would become a big thing for Bond films. In From Russia with Love, we get to see a special briefcase that has a throwing knife attached into it, ammunition in the bottom of it, extra ammunition, and a tear gas cartridge. If you open the case the wrong way, the tear gas cartridge would explode in your face. And so it had tons of cool things like that. So now that we've established all these things and they were things that fans really liked, well, again, third time's a charm. Goldfinger, the quintessential James Bond film. To me, it's the Bond movie that I think Connery looks the absolute best in, and definitely brings the Bond character to life. He has nailed it to a T. The suaveness is there. The humor is there. Dry humor. The puns after I've done away with somebody, killed them, or whatever.
That dry British wit.
Dry British wit.
When was that one released?
1 year.
1 year,
64.
jeez.
So we kind of brought in a different director for this. Director for the first two was Terrence Young, who did not a bad job or anything like that. Definitely brought the Bond character to life. Guy Hamilton stepped in, who would later go on to do other various Bond films as well. And really took a different showing to James Bond. Gert Forb was great as, or Goldfinger as the villain. And interesting things that some people may not know either. His voice was dubbed over for the film. His English wasn't really very up to par, even though even supposed to have an accent. Too heavy of an accent. And his voice was dubbed over. Great dubbing job, because even I learned that in due time, and I never would have known that unless I had read it somewhere. Goldfinger, what makes it the quintessential Bond film? The gadgets, much more elaborate. And we also get to see for the first time the quintessential James Bond car, which would show up in other Bond films throughout time, which was an Aston Martin DB5, which very slick piece of machinery at the time. And again, of course, it was loaded with ammunition and a tracking device to be able to track other cars, and machine guns at the front, and of course the coolest thing, an ejector seat, which of course everybody loved. And this was also where the turning point for Bond girls also came about. Again, Honor Blackman, beautiful woman, fit the profile of a Bond girl perfectly, with the perfect Bond girl name. If you were ever going to remember a Bond girl, this is going to be your Bond girl, because she was Pussy Galore. Which was so freaking awesome. It's unbelievable. And in 1964, to have a name like that almost actually wound up hurting the film, because the States actually almost did not let the film premiere because of her name. It was too racy for the film, they thought. But due to the popularity of James Bond,
which, when you think about it, though, it is pretty racy, because you don't normally like. I mean, even to have a movie today where the girl in it was named Pussy Galore would draw a lot of people's attention to it.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, to hear it for the first time is kind of just like your mind kind of veers off of the film for a brief moment. I'm sorry, did she just say what I think she just said? Because I'm pretty sure she just said her name was Pussy Galore.
I think the only one that comes close was A Lot of Vagina.
A Lot of Vagina, exactly. In Austin Powers. And Austin Powers were great spoofs of James Bond.
And you know what? And we'll get to that. We'll talk about parodies and homages and stuff like that later. But
there's a lot of history of James Bond, so I'm going to move along quite quickly here. Numbers for Goldfinger showed even better than the first two films. So now we move along to really starting to get into James Bond and Thunderball, which was the next one, which was released again 1 year later in '65. This was the first time that James Bond was really stuck in a bind, that the world was in danger. Goldfinger just wanted to destroy the gold supply of the United States and set off a radioactive bomb in Fort Knox and make all the gold supply radioactive and bring down the price of their gold, so the price of his gold would go up. And I mean, don't get me wrong, that's pretty horrific. But Thunderball was the first time that the world was in danger. And some great special effects for the film. Fantastic underwater sequences as well. A lot of the film is shot underwater, a lot of scuba diving action. Not to mention a huge, massive underwater fight sequence at the end. Spear guns and all, sharks, the whole 9 yards. But basically, Thunderball had the concept of 2 atomic bombs being stolen, and, somewhere in the east and somewhere in the west being threatened with these atomic bombs. Again, going back to the roots with Spectre. And
again, pretty closely mirroring, because this still in the 60s was the nuclear arms race between,
well, exactly. This is what we're
the
moving
United
into
States
now.
and everyone else.
Nuclear arms started coming in, so again, we move back into the concept of, like, what would it be like if what would Bond do if Bond had to deal with a situation like this? Again, new gadgets brought out again. One big one that we get to see at the start of the film, which somebody actually had to fly this thing and so forth, is a jetpack that Bond puts on his back to make a stellar escape at the beginning after killing an assassin that had killed one of his colleagues, and runs out, puts this jetpack on, and some guy actually had to fly this thing, go up in the air and maneuver and fly this thing.
Jetpacks nowadays are very dangerous, unreliable, and not really common.
Well,
so
that's,
to
this
do that,
didn't have a lot of flight time
in what, 1965?
65.
Kudos to that stuntman.
Right. And Bond films what made them costly too was, besides certain things having to be shot in studios, obviously, things that required big elaborate sets, Bond films were shot on location. So if there's a lot of map jumping, say in a Bond film, like, we're traveling to each location and we're filming in each location. So being James Bond is very tiring at times. It can be very physically demanding. And again, that's just back in the 60s. We haven't even moved into like the 70s, 80s, 90s, today. Thunderball was the last big Bond film. The next few numbers kind of started to plummet, and Connery, for Your Eyes Only in 67, kind of started showing his age a little bit, and he said, I kind of want this to be my last stint as James Bond. So he wound up doing that one. Numbers kind of dropped a little bit in the box office, nothing too damaging. And moving on after that, George Lazenby, an Australian kind of model actor, came in to portray James Bond. Had a little bit of different insight of the character, and different director as well, again, for this one too. This Bond film is hit or miss with me. I like Lazenby's portrayal of James Bond. It was a little bit more hard-edged. He was a little bit more smash mouth.
How was it received, like, critically or by audiences? Because it would have been hard after, what was it? What are we at now? 5, right? Connery Bonds?
5 Connery Bonds.
Yeah, and now you move to a different Bond.
We moved to a different guy. Numbers in the box office for this one kind of suffered a little bit. I think the change up from Connery to this guy was a little bit too dramatic. People didn't have a problem with his portrayal of James Bond. I think it was just the changeover. And this one also, and I'm sorry, big spoiler alert, but Bond gets married in this one. And it kind of almost looks like this is going to be the end of James Bond. Which, unfortunately for Bond, tragedy strikes and the films are able to continue. Also, what this one does, and I'm sorry, I have to jump back to the 5th Connery one for You Only Live Twice. In You Only Live Twice, Bond not only again deals with Spectre, but he also meets his arch nemesis, who he would do battle with in the next few films to come, which was Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who was kind of like the man of Spectre. Like, this guy was Spectre. He was like the leader of the organization. He would kind of be like what the Joker was to Batman. Batman's like arch nemesis, hated him, but almost like he needed him. You know, that kind of dealy do. And Blofeld would kind of be the only one who a few times would slip through Bond's fingers and would actually be the cause for Bond's heartbreak in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the George Lazenby one, which again pushes Bond to kind of like having to sort out a vendetta before we can actually really concentrate on going back to missions again.
So it's quite a bit different.
Not
just Bond himself, but the movie.
The movie itself was very different. I think other reasons that kind of made it suffer. This one was the first one that was over the 2-hour mark. This one hit about 2.5 hours almost, and I think a little bit of the over length was maybe a kill at the time, and I think people that took a look at a lot of things in there that were not very James Bond like, but were kind of needed for the story for things that were leading up to. Don't get me wrong, there are big payoffs again. Once we kind of make it through that stuff, we jump back into a lot of big action sequences and a lot of things that certainly don't make you fall asleep. They keep you on the edge of your seat very much so. George Lazenby, though, it was said, though, he was very difficult to work with, and was not very receptive to doing a lot of things that the director wanted him to do, and kind of making James Bond what he was. He kind of had his own different little views of what James Bond would be, and the director didn't want to change any of those. Spent a lot of the time flirting with a lot of the ladies in the film, and that made it very difficult. The ladies kind of found that a little bit hard at times to kind of work with him. He did not want to come back to do another James Bond film. He only did this one, and that kind of left the producers and MGM Studios kind of up in arms for the next Bond film. So there'd be another 2-year stint in between. So 71, Diamonds Are Forever would come out, and Sean Connery would come back to be James Bond.
I didn't actually know that.
Which, to bring him back, actually cost a substantial amount of money in that due span of time. It cost $1.4 million to bring him back at the time, which deeply dug into the film's budget.
Well, that's a lot more than the entire budget for the first Bond movie.
For the first Bond movie, exactly. So it dug into the film's budget a lot. A little bit of globe-trotting here and there, but most of the film was shot in the United States, again, due to the film's budget. And it shows a lot deeply in the special effects area as well. Diamonds Are Forever, though, great fun. It is a fantastic, great smuggling Bond caper. Little bit more sly tongue-in-cheek, and again, this is going to be repeated quite a fair times, ladies and gentlemen, but again, products of their time. So now that we've moved into the 70s, things like Playboy and kind of a little bit more sexier personifications were coming about now and stuff. So the Bond girl, when we first see her a few times step out in just her bra and panties. Like very skimpy panties and bra a few times. So the sex appeal was starting to come out a little bit more, and the Bond girls were starting to stand out a little bit more now too. Now this Bond girl didn't really have so much of a racy name like we're looking at for Pussy Galore, but Bond girls also started stepping in now as just girls in general that Bond would have interaction with. Mm-hmm. They would have maybe little bit parts and we wouldn't see them for very long, or they'd wind up becoming a victim and wind up dying. But there is one that Bond winds up meeting, who is played by Lana Wood, and her name is Plenty O'Toole, which Bond, I mean, after she introduces herself to Bond, which she says, "Hi, I'm Plenty O'Toole," and he looks at her and says, "Named after your father, perhaps." Again, there's the sly tongue-in-cheek, maybe a little bit sexy tongue-in-cheek, if the humor's there, if your humor palette is there. This one actually wasn't too bad, but at this due point in time, too, we were also bringing in different writers, too, that were kind of helping out the guy who was originally writing all the screenplays for the earlier Bond films, and people that would maybe be able to change James Bond and bring James Bond into the 70s. Tom Mankiewicz also wound up helping out write the screenplay for Diamonds Are Forever, and he would actually do the next two after that as well, which was Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, which helped change Bond into the 70s. Diamonds Are Forever was Connery's last go, and now we have to find a new James Bond, so enter Roger Moore. And Roger Moore kind of fell into little bit of a difficult time for Bond. We're looking at the early 70s. 73 was the debut for Roger Moore and Live and Let Die, which I'm going to veer off for a second. Live and Let Die, sung by Paul McCartney and Wings, considered the most popular James Bond theme song, which it is. It's totally awesome. One of my faves. Bond would have to deal with, in this one, blacks and black gangs. Because the black movement was coming in. The Cold War was kind of over. Blacks were really starting to make their mark in America and American society. And a lot of black culture was coming in. Live and Let Die at the time was actually almost considered to be a black exploitation film. I think Bond and the Bond girl and Bond's friend are the only white people in the film, to be honest with you. So the film deals with an American gangster who is supplying the States with heroin. And he's also tied in with an island voodoo kind of king, voodoo kind of priest. So he uses black magic to protect his poppy fields, his heroin fields, which he grows in the Caribbean, and he ships over to the States and does business with this American gangster. So it doesn't sound like something that, Bond would really deal with.
But again, product of its time.
It's a product of its time.
For the early 70s,
And the drug movement was big at the time, and again,
the
black movement was big at the time.
The hippie movement and everything, Woodstock in 69. So the 70s was disco and drugs and
everything like that. Were very big things. There was also things for Live and Let Die, for a little bit of more Bond history too. There's a little bit of a love scene in the film where Bond actually has a love scene with a black woman, played by Gloria Hendricks, and the love scene was actually cut from the film because at the time they thought it might be too racy to see this white man in this love scene with this black woman, and didn't know how well that would be perceived at the time. We see them making out a little bit, but I don't think that was generally supposed to be the extent of the love scene. I think quite a fair bit of it was actually cut from the film.
Well, and the whole interracial thing on TV was relatively new because it wasn't all that long before it in Star Trek that William Shatner and I want to say Michelle. It's going to bug me now.
Yeah.
But she played Lieutenant Uhura.
Right.
And they had the first interracial kiss on TV. And
Yes.
that was, I believe, the late 60s.
That was late 60s,
So-
most definitely. So the interracial thing, again, though, the black movement wasn't so big coming into the 60s. Again, that was more seen in the 70s.
Mhm.
And I think the blacks coming in and making their mark at the time, I think that kind of maybe... I think the love scene, to me, myself, personally, my own thoughts would have been cut just... I think because, again, it would have just been, like, more upshowing the blacks and this white man kind of getting the better of this black woman before he turns on her and threatens to kill her unless she gives him the information that he wants. And I think that was the reason why maybe cutting the love scene a little bit, maybe kind of went that way a little bit. Live and Let Die didn't hit so well in the box office, and neither did The Man with the Golden Gun, which would be the next one. Christopher Lee portrays a bad guy who is Francisco Scaramanga, who is the Man with the Golden Gun. The golden gun in the film is an actual golden gun. It was actually an 18-karat gold firearm, which actually fired bullets. The film starts out not bad and has good story. Bond Girl's kind of a floozy, unfortunately, played by Britt Eklund. not so good. The film kind of veers off and kind of becomes a little bit over lengthy and kind of snoozy. This one was a little bit of a miss as well. Again, for people who are Bond fans who may not have known, Christopher Lee, who played Scaramanga, which I guess I kind of already said, was related to Ian Fleming. And Ian Fleming actually wanted him to be Dr. No for the very first Bond film. Unfortunately, Christopher Lee did not fit the character at the time and was denied the part, but obviously would show up later on in this film. Numbers didn't hit well for this one either. Numbers would not hit well for Roger Moore, and Roger Moore would not bring alive the Bond character until his third installment in 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me, which is fantastic. Fantastic Bond film. At the time, was considered the most lavish James Bond film, but was also considered cursed Bond film. This Bond film had a lot of problems when trying to be made. Huge, elaborate sets, and actually Pinewood Studios in London, England actually had to have a separate stage built for some of the sets that they wanted because some of the sets were exceedingly large and exceedingly elaborate. This Bond film is loaded with major sex appeal and some of the sexiest women, including the Bond girl who is Major Amazova, Russian agent, or her spy name Triple X, which is freaking awesome. I think that's fantastic. And we would also get introduced for the first time to the steel-toothed nemesis known as Jaws, who is played by Richard Kiel. Who turned out as a great henchman. And again, great gadgets for this one, especially a great spy car, which was a Lotus Esprit, which actually turned into a submarine underwater, which, again, we actually built a car that I think, I'm pretty sure I was actually designed. There were 3 separate cars in different goes to show it turned into a submarine. This one, though, was also considered cursed Bond film due to the fact that while filming in Egypt, most of the crew and actors and stuff wound up getting food poisoning. And food actually was flowing in. The producers actually paid to have food flowing into them each day from the States. One of the major soundstage set pieces actually burned to the ground at one due point in time, and that set them back. That was quite costly as well. So there were a lot of problems with this Bond film and bringing it to life as well. Jumping ahead, Roger Moore would later on start doing a lot of battle with Russians and so forth, and we would move again back deeper into, again, the Cold War and moving back into the Russians and bringing the Russians back in.
Which in the 80s became very prevalent again.
Right, and that's where we would start seeing it. We would start seeing it from 81 and For Your Eyes Only through to Octopussy, through to A View to a Kill, which was Roger Moore's last stint as James Bond. For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy were quite good James Bonds. A View to a Kill was a big drop, a huge drop for Bond. It's probably considered one of the worst. It is a major snooze fest. Christopher Walken as the bad guy cannot even save this film. Absolutely horrible.
And that was Roger Moore's last.
That was Roger Moore's last go as James Bond.
And is that because it was poorly done, or was
the story was very poorly done? And it's actually a little bit more violent at times than a lot of other Bond films. The Bond girl was a complete ditz, unfortunately, played by Tanya Roberts. And unfortunately, also Roger Moore's age was a problem as well. He was 55 years old for this.
Wow.
The Bond girl was only 30 years old. He looked old enough to be her grandpa at the time. and very hokey, which it's also unfortunate to say because of View to a Kill, the theme song, which was done by Duran Duran, was actually the very first James Bond theme song to make the top Billboard 100, which is about the only decent piece of history that A View to a Kill has. Moving on to Timothy Dalton, he kind of changed a little bit the edge of James Bond. Moving up into the later 80s, we were still dealing with the Cold War and the Russians for his first stint. But Timothy Dalton brought a little bit more attitude to James Bond. He was a little bit more defiant and kind of at times made up his own rules when he was out in the field. It wasn't very prone to being suave more than he would be to what am I looking for? Just kind of get out there, like do his own thing.
Yeah. Not follow orders quite as
not
much.
follow orders quite as much. He is not my favorite James Bond in any way, shape, or form. Timothy Dalton, certainly a man of the 80s. There is nothing suave about him. There's nothing good looking about him. He actually, for most people, actually falls in for a lot of people as their favorite James Bond. I will say, unfortunately, he is a little bit underrated. The films are good. He not so much.
So maybe when he's a lot of people's favorite Bond, it's because he's in their favorite Bond film more
possibly,
than he's their favorite.
Or
Bond.
he brought a little bit of a change. Again, as I said, to James Bond, bringing a little bit more of that attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of dropped out from the 60s, the 70s, the early 80s. Let's bring a little bit of more of a different stint to James Bond. Let's see what James Bond would be like with a little bit more of an attitude. Kind of maybe going against his government and kind of setting up his own stint.
And you know what? Late 80s, early 90s, that was like the rise of grunge music and stuff like that, which was, a little bit about an attitude and stuff like that.
Precisely. Now, bringing up that note, Timothy Dalton was the James Bond who did the last of the books. So now we really don't have any more stories to go on. So we've run through quite a substantial amount of time. We've run through 25 years of James Bond leading up to this due point in time. And 89 was the last Bond film where there were books to make stories out of. And with your concept of the 90s and grunge music coming out and an attitude.
The early 90s had an attitude.
Early 90s had attitude, and we saw it with a lot of things. TV shows, sports, pro wrestling being one, and an attitude
and you know what?
coming out.
It's in a lot of things, too, because you look at the late 80s into the early 90s. And that's when you had grunge music, like we had said, coming out. But look at your sitcoms. Roseanne, Married with Children. Like, this was not the Cosbys.
No,
you know what I mean. This was
we brought a little bit more of the sarcastic.
You know what I think it is? I think the early '90s was a lot more blue collar.
Right,
blue collar, everyday working man,
and that
has a little bit of an attitude and a little bit of cynicism. Because gone are, the '70s where, like, you look at that '70s show, and you get a guy like Red Foreman.
Right.
Vietnam vet, rigid, I just, working the factory job, owns the house, owns the car. But then when you get into the 90s, it changed a little bit. There was more of a separation, I think, it's a lot more prevalent today, but I think back then is when you started to see less of a middle class and more of a lower middle class. And that's when you get like Roseanne and stuff. And even like with Fresh Prince brought an attitude to it as well. Because
Absolutely.
You had, the Banks family that were wealthy and everything, but then you had Will Smith, the inner city kid who had nothing growing up, going to stay with them. And, Yeah, like to me, the early '90s, it had an attitude about it, a blue collar, down to earth, relatable
Right.
kind of thing. So that transferred into James Bond.
So, on that note, there would be a 6-year hiatus before we ever heard anything from James Bond again. Now, all past directors and writers who helped bring the first 25, 27 years of James Bond alive, fantastic job. No matter what numbers were like in the box office, somehow we managed to be able to keep people interested to bring James Bond back.
Anytime you have a movie franchise that spans like 15 movies over 25 years,
over 25 years,
that's incredible.
So if we take a look at a run, because there was quite a few that I left out, and this is bear with me, ladies and gentlemen, but like to start out the go, Dr. No, very first, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, Man with the Golden Gun, Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, License to Kill.
So 16.
16 films we've done so far.
And the fact that you just ran, I'm going to attest to the fact that he ain't reading anything. He is like some sort of James Bond Rain Man.
If you want dates as well, I can give you dates.
You're like a James Bond Rain Man, dude.
If you want directors, I can give you directors as well, which I'm going to do actually right now. The Terrence Youngs of the 60s, Guy Hamilton of the 60s, 70s, John Glenn, who did quite a fair stint of the 80s, as well as with Timothy Dalton and ending off Roger Moore, and Richard Maybaum, who did a fantastic job with the screenplays of bringing James Bond to life through the 60s up through the 80s. Fantastic.
Okay, so now we get into the 90s.
90s.
And this is like a new era of James Bond then.
We are going to completely change the subject here and revamp James Bond, because that's where the 6-year hiatus came about. So as I said, we had no more books for stories, so now we have to create a story. And thus bringing about, and we have to find a new James Bond too, because Timothy Dalton, who did want to come back, unfortunately the 6-year hiatus was too much of a wait for him, and he just kind of fell off the veer of wanting to do it. So now we had to find somebody, and welcome Pierce Brosnan, who
is he's my favorite Bond, and I mean it's going to be like the whole product of your time thing. That's me. I'm a product of the early to mid the early 90s straight through up to now, I suppose, right?
Today.
But yeah, like that to me. That I think that's the first Bond movie I ever saw.
Was GoldenEye?
Was GoldenEye.
So GoldenEye would be the next one. Now, Pierce Brosnan, let's get a little bit of history of Pierce Brosnan here. Now, he would have been James Bond when Timothy Dalton took the part. Unfortunately, Pierce Brosnan was too young, and by not getting the part, he went on to do Remington Steele. But Pierce Brosnan grew up as a Bond fan. He is now married to a former Bond girl, and actually also went as far as to purchase Ian Fleming's typewriter when Ian Fleming passed away for $52,000, which he owns. Wow. Useless tidbit, but there we go. This is to show just what a diehard Bond fan Pierce Brosnan grew up as. So to get this opportunity for him, and for his first starting go, when I say we revamped Bond, we brought in completely whole new crew. We are talking nobody that worked on any of the original ones. So a brand new director, Martin Campbell, who had a fantastic view and visual of changing James Bond.
And you know what? The technology jump in those 6 years.
Big
for
time.
Special effects and things like that
was
crazy.
So now we're going to get into things like that. We have things like the internet that has brought about. Computers now are the big go-to and the big weapon.
Laser beams.
Laser beams and
On their
satellites that
frickin'
fire
heads.
nuclear weapons, which is what GoldenEye is based on. It's based on a nuclear-based satellite weapon that fires an electromagnetic pulse down and wipe everything out. And we're still doing battle with the Russians for GoldenEye, but the also big change that people noticed right off the bat was the change in the attitude of James Bond. So we are talking much, much more in your face, hard hitting action. Much more spectacular gunfights. And that one punch theory, gone.
Mm-hmm.
Out the window. Pierce Brosnan, much more smoother and he was almost, I don't want to say too suave. His more suaveness was more there than his instinct to beat a confession out of somebody.
He was a cocky son of a bitch.
He was actually very cocky.
Yeah.
As Bond, which again, going back, the books were like that. Again, like I said in the start, the Bond books, Bond was not your smooth cut diamond. Very rough around the edges, and very cocky. He had his ego sometimes got the better of him.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't see that with Pierce Brosnan, but again, as you said, cocky was starting to come out. Attitude, much more attitude was starting to come out. And we started seeing other sides of James Bond through Pierce Brosnan as well, like, that like things like my friends, girls that I meet, they're just tools. They're just objects. I don't care. My whole main goal is a mission. I don't care what happens to you, being so stone cold is what keeps me alive. And that's actually a reference that's made in GoldenEye. So again, we get a little bit more in depth of the Bond character as well at the same time. Sean Bean, who did a great job as Alec Trevelyan and the Bond villain, which I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that's a huge spoiler if you've never seen GoldenEye. But it's a fantastic story, and we even went ahead to also change the music. And the guy who actually did and composed the music for GoldenEye, Eric Sierra, has a great style of music. It almost has a very dark tone to it almost. Another film, if you've actually seen it, the Leon, the Professional, he also did the music for that. If you remember what the score was like for that film, again, another very, very just kind of empty, just kind of very dark tone. And GoldenEye has a very dark tone to it at times as well, for the film too. So that really brings it alive as well. Pierce Brosnan, unfortunately, after GoldenEye, his stint as James Bond, having to keep recreating, thinking of new stories was difficult at the time. Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day. Again, the numbers were brought back up, but not as good as GoldenEye. If you're looking for the same kind of concept as GoldenEye, the action is there. Again, as I said, don't get me wrong, and fantastic changes. Also, other changes which are kind of left out. You will see a new M, a new boss who will be portrayed by Judi Dench, a woman. You will see Moneypenny, a different Moneypenny, who will lean more towards feminism and stuff like that, and kinds of things like that. So there won't be that kind of same flirtatious kind of go between Bond and Moneypenny as you would have seen back in the earlier times. You see different changes towards that now. You also see different changes in the character of M when GoldenEye comes about as well. There's a point in GoldenEye when M refers to Bond as a misogynist, sexist dinosaur who's a relic of the Cold War, whose boyish charms are wasted away and kinds of things like that. So a very kind of different view that M has on James Bond, and also kind of at this time, like things like spies and secret agents were kind of not so much a used tool anymore. Again, like what we talked about, how there was technology now, computers now and stuff like that. We didn't really need things like spies to be able to...
Well, it'd be harder to be a spy with the facial and voice recognition technologies and stuff that were coming out.
Absolutely.
And things like that.
But again, that's reasons for things like Q Branch and his gadgets that would keep Bond alive. Again, there's also references made in earlier Bond films that if it wasn't for Q Branch, Bond would have been dead a long time ago.
Those Bond movies, though, the Brosnan ones, forget which it was. I want to say it was Tomorrow Never Dies. The Bond girl was Christmas Jones or something.
No, that's The World Is Not Enough. Who's played by Denise Richards, who's a total floozy.
I know. But what was her name?
Ever.
Was it Christmas Jones?
Yeah, Christmas Jones was her name.
But it was my favorite Bond line ever was at the end of the movie, right after they make love, and he turns to her and says, "And I thought Christmas only came once a year."
Absolutely, and that
to me sums up James Bond.
Friggin' hilarious. And again, there's the wit right there. And even though again we're coming across Bond girls with obscure names like Christmas Jones,
well, I mean, it's no pussy galore.
It's okay, yeah, it's no pussy galore or anything like that. Pierce Brosnan wouldn't really so much get to have the fun with the stint of Bond girl names as other Bonds did in the past. His gadgets, though, and his technology, though, were fantastic. Some of his cars that he wound up getting in Tomorrow Never Dies, like his car was voice activated, had spectacular gadgets, and we started doing things like adding missiles and rockets to the car now, and
seems like a logical step.
Yeah, absolutely. Why not, eh? And the best thing that I like about his car in Tomorrow Never Dies too is it can be controlled by his cell phone with a touchpad. You drive it with his finger. He doesn't even have to be in the car. Voice activated, the whole 9 yards, which I thought was really cool idea for a car. Kind of like Die Another Day as well, which before I go into his stint about Die Another Day, his car was also really cool in that the car was surrounded by a bunch of like different mirrors that would make the car go invisible. It could become an invisible car or be visible depending on whatever you wanted. But again, neat idea for the car, and again, use of technology and ideas for things like that. Die Another Day. This one for Pierce Brosnan, I kind of felt a little bit sorry for. We're up to the 20th James Bond film, which is a big stint at this due span of time. My first problem with the film, the story was a little bit weak. The villain was weak, played by Toby Stephens. His co-villain was actually much cooler actually than he was. Zhao, who had the diamonds all blown up in his face, somehow he was actually cooler than the actual villain was. What I also didn't like was Halle Berry, and it's not that I don't like her. I didn't like the fact that there's a lot throughout the film that she upstages James Bond, and for the 20th James Bond film, that is not good or cool in any way, shape, or form. I think Lee Tamahori, who was the director, took a wrong stint in that go, and I didn't like his use of Halle Berry and having her as not only the Bond girl but another secret agent as well at the same time, an American secret agent, working with Bond. And there's actually quite a few scenes, like I said, where she upstages James Bond. Not good for a last showing for Pierce Brosnan. Great theme song though by Madonna for Die Another Day.
Now, so that was Pierce Brosnan's last one.
That's 2002.
And was that just because he was getting older?
Yeah, he was getting a little bit older, and again, like I said, so revamping the James Bond and making things even much more physical than what we were doing before. Now we have much more physicality thrown in there.
So you need somebody a little younger to do it.
Somebody a little bit younger, and as time progresses, like the globe trotting and action sequences filming, and we're looking at things like a lot of much more bigger budgets, and the films are a little bit longer now. We're not looking at that 1 hour and 50 minute. We're looking at the 2 hour and 10 minute mark to, looking a little bit over that. So a lot more work, a lot more stunt work, a lot more effort, a lot more lengthy time to make these things drawn out, and the physical wear and tear is too much. You see Pierce Brosnan really age as time progresses as his stint as James Bond.
So so Pierce Brosnan is done, and now we need a new James Bond.
We need a new James Bond.
This was 2002. So what's our time span till we get a new
time
James
span?
Bond?
We're looking at another 4 years now until we see James Bond come alive again. Now, keeping James Bond going and revamping James Bond, cool idea. But the creating stories to keep James Bond alive didn't really work. So, 2006, we revamped James Bond again. And believe me when I tell you, folks, Daniel Craig may very well be the best James Bond known to man. I think he clearly, although Connery being the original and was obviously the one to bring Bond alive in the 60s, sure, that's fantastic. But Daniel Craig took everything to a whole new level. And when I say revamp, once again, we brought back director Martin Campbell for Casino Royale, which would be the next go in 2006. And this story, we made a prequel. And when I say prequel, we are talking James Bond fresh out of spy school. Like, I've done no missions. I've killed nobody. I am a fresh 00. Here I go on my first mission. So to revamp James Bond in so many words or less without going on a huge friggin' ramble about Daniel Craig, when he fucks somebody up, he fucks somebody up. And he gets fucked up in the process. And we're not talking like a couple punches here and there. We're talking about faces busted up. I am bleeding left, right, and center. I got black eyes, broken fingers. And I've literally just beaten the guy that's dead now to the living end of next week. Everything about him, his face, his character, everything. When he kills somebody, he fucking looks like a killer. There are looks in those eyes that I just would not want looking back at me. When he makes love to a woman, he looks like a lover. And when he wants to be compassionate, like, he can still bring out that suave, compassionate, tender side of James Bond.
So, would you say that he would be more in line with what the books
Absolutely
were for a James Bond?
Absolutely. So Daniel Craig, when he was going and Casino Royale was set to debut, a lot of critics started really panning Daniel Craig, and it sounded like this one was going to be a big flop. Critics did not like the fact of things that they had heard that, like, he was blonde. He was too fit. He was too buff as James Bond. Quite a few people had complained a little bit that they looked too old for the Bond character. But when the film debuted, you know what? I don't even have words to put it in. But the action sequences alone are literally mind-numbing. The story for Casino Royale is a fantastic story, and I think Daniel Craig just comes on the scene with so much character to bring the Bond character alive. I mean, he is so stone cold that it's almost like you could pour boiling water down this guy's throat and he would piss ice cubes. Like, just absolutely fantastic. You cannot help but be drawn to his character of James Bond. And it was said afterwards that it took 44 years to find a James Bond that we wanted.
Wow.
To bring to life the character of James Bond that we always wanted to bring alive, but we totally couldn't at this due point in time. Daniel Craig's Bond is way more like the books. I'm going to shoot first a lot of the times. I'll ask questions later.
And that makes sense too, because if Casino Royale was him fresh out of spy school, there'd be a lot of things that he hasn't learned yet.
Absolutely.
And things like that. So this was 2006. This was Casino Royale. Where do we go from here?
We go to 2008, and we go to Quantum of Solace, which is, and I mean, we're picking up right where we leave off from Casino Royale, and Quantum of Solace picks up.
So another prequel, essentially?
These are all prequels that we're talking about. Daniel Craig is all in prequel concept. So Quantum of Solace takes him deeper in, and we meet a different villain and so forth, and we learn where these villains are coming from an organization which is called Quantum. Of course, they have all their own plans for whatever. And this one, again, very physically demanding, very hard-hitting, very smash-mouth. There's certainly no sleeping points in this one in any way, shape, or form. And again, we see, again, great Daniel Craig and so forth. Nothing really much to talk about this one, again, because it's a continuation from previous James Bond, from Casino Royale. Again, though, we still see certain things. So going back to Casino Royale and you talking about bringing up mistakes that Bond makes. In Casino Royale, we see very rough around the edges James Bond. We see more ego. Not, what was the word you used for Pierce Brosnan?
Cocky. So
we're talking ego.
Not confidence, but arrogance.
Arrogance. Extreme arrogance, which gets him into a shitload of trouble. Because he doesn't trust his instincts. He doesn't follow his instincts. He's bent on the sight that I'm James Bond. I'm a secret agent. I have a license to kill. If I want to, I can shoot you right now if I want to. Because I can. Because I'm James Bond. We're looking at that kind of ego. When I walk into a room, it's like, my shit doesn't stink. Mm-hmm. I'm James Bond. I know everything. I know everything about you. And yeah, I can do this and I can do that.
So when we move on to the next film that Daniel Craig does that simmer down at all, or does that stay?
Casino Royale ends with Bond making a very big mistake, and he winds up falling in love, which is not Bond character-like. And the girl he falls in love with winds up getting killed, and he can't get over his ego. He's bent on figuring out who killed this girl. And so we still see him stuck in a personal vendetta. That's number one, which clouds his judgment throughout the film. So again, we still see mistakes, and we still see him stuck, bent on this personal vendetta, while also being in this mission of whatever Quantum of Solace brings about. Which again is unfortunately dealing with an environmentalist, which sounds kind of weird.
But again, for the 2000s, that's...
For the 2000s, again, it's things that were prevalent at the time, with things that were going on. Quantum of Solace didn't do as well in the box office as Casino Royale did. Pierce Brosnan in Casino Royale and Daniel Craig brought Bond back up. Brought Bond back up to where it should be. Numbers were showing again. Casino Royale alone in the box office, altogether worldwide, like just under $800 million, which is spectacular. Yeah. I mean, that's bringing Bond all back to life after the last crap go of the lighter 80s, mid 80s, and so forth.
So
We are about to move into 50 years of James Bond.
So when was the next film? So we had 2008, Quantum of Solace.
2012, Skyfall would come about for 50 years of James Bond. And this is difficult because I do not have words to put for Skyfall. Skyfall is awe-inspiring. If you have grown up from the beginning as a Bond fan and have followed absolutely everything like myself, I can't even begin to describe to you what Skyfall all brings about. It is everything you could expect for 50 years of James Bond. You get much, much deeper into the inside of the Bond character. Like, we're going way beyond Bond himself. We're going right back to the roots of James Bond. The roots. Where he grew up. Things like that, everything. Fantastic villain. Played by Javier Bardem, who's a former MI6 agent who was betrayed by his government. And his whole concept throughout the film is to expose MI6 for what they really are. You know, like everybody would think they're heroes. No. He is here to expose them that they're full of crap, pretty much, in so many words or less. Absolutely spectacular action sequences filmed for this one, and beautifully shot. Some absolutely fantastic camera work. And director Sam Mendes carries this Bond film, and I think he put everything into this that 50 years of Bond could ask for. My face was just glued to the floor the whole time. I laughed. I'm not going to lie to you, I actually shed a tear for a couple of things. Skyfall, in the end, for 50 years of James Bond, and this would also become a problem afterwards too, is the only Bond film to hit the $1 billion mark in the box office. $250 million budget, $1 billion in the box office. Like Bond or hate Bond, that's impressive after 50 years. But as I said, this would also be the problem. And I had stated this right from the get-go when the next Bond film was in production. Because what we've done is, the fact that Daniel Craig is all prequels, the next Bond film would be Spectre. And we have talked about Spectre throughout this podcast, and Spectre was the stint of Sean Connery, and going back to Sean Connery. So what we've done here is, what makes this Bond film a problem first off, is we are about to cross storylines. Anybody that is a fan, and a diehard super fan, is not going to be pleased with this. Dr. No was, going back to Dr. No in the very first Bond film, was supposed to be Bond's first encounter with Spectre. So when Bond first encounters Dr. No face to face, they kind of talk back and forth, and Dr. No says to him, like, I'm a member of Spectre. And Bond replies with this kind of odd look on his face, like, Spectre? Like, he has no idea what that is. And of course, Dr. No explains that Spectre is an organization which stands for Special Executive for Counterterrorism, Revenge, Extortion. 4 great cornerstones of power, headed by the greatest criminal minds on the face of the earth. And of course, Spectre leads up to all the things that it stands for as well, extortion and revenge and all these kinds of things. And to us, we are led to believe that that is Bond's first encounter with Spectre. But if Daniel Craig is all based around prequels, well, now that means you're saying that he has encountered Spectre before. He has encountered Blofeld before. Which Connery was actually the stint of encountering Blofeld beforehand.
So, is that just sloppy writing, or is that them just assuming that there aren't that many diehard fans left from the beginning?
I think what it was to keep fans of today, of the younger generation who got into Bond when Brosnan took over, and like this GoldenEye, this Bond is actually cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like GoldenEye, awesome. Well, we want to keep these new fans alive as well. It's kind of almost like saying we've remade some Bond films prior. I don't really know what to say. I was so baffled and I was so upset, and a lot of other fans were upset as well. And this was where the problem came in, because Spectre actually lost money. It did not hit the $1 billion mark, so right there, that's bad. Lost $200 million in the box office, only brought in an $800 million showing, $800+ million showing, which, don't get me wrong, that still ain't bad. But we've lost money again. And
that was the most recent.
That's the most recent one.
So have you heard anything about another one?
They are in the go for starting a new one right now. Title has not been thrown out, but Daniel Craig has come back to do this one. This will be his last go as James Bond. There is already talk that I'm not sure what they plan on doing. A couple of people are already upset with the story that is focused around this James Bond, and a lot of people feel that there's a lot of people working on the film or in the film have just kind of more or less stated on the fact that you're going to have to bring out a lot more than what you're kind of putting on the table right now to really make this one kind of stand out. As this being Daniel Craig's last go as James Bond, there is talk in future that if Bond chooses to keep going, that there is look at bringing in a black James Bond, possibly Idris Elba, or a female James Bond, to see what that would be like.
Okay, and this is where it gets interesting. And now we got a couple things that I wanted to talk about still, kind of revolving around James Bond.
All means.
We're already just hit over the limit of what we normally do for a podcast.
That is okay.
So this one will be a little longer, but we'll kind of go through them a little quicker, because we don't have like another hour.
No,
but
we will try and historize James Bond the best we can.
So with them talking about a black James Bond or a female James Bond coming out next, here's a popular theory that a lot of people have probably heard that's being thrown around, and that is that all the different James Bonds were in fact different James Bonds. Right. So Sean Connery was a James Bond, and then Roger Moore was a different James Bond, in the same sense that they changed M, and that they changed, So James Bond and 007, it's a code name and a call sign for that, like they're the number one secret agent of MI6.
Right.
So James Bond is not the same man. And that's why you can go over the span of well over 50 years now. Because it isn't supposed to be the same man.
We know it in reality, in the fact that obviously actors are actors, they're human beings. They age. The theory with that is you diehard Bond fans out there may totally get this or see this, but every single time you see James Bond meet with M or Q, he is never referred to as James Bond. He's always referred to as 007. Always. When he is in the office, when he is at MI6, he is 007. He is not James Bond. James Bond is just a field name.
See, and this, you know what? And this brings up another interesting point. Because we also wanted to talk about homages and like spoofs, basically,
Right.
of James Bond. So this brings one. This kind of ties it together here. So Kingsman.
Awesome
Which-
movies.
Have you seen the second one yet?
Yes.
They're both great.
Both equally just as good. Absolutely.
They are. They were basically described as James Bond on steroids.
Absolutely.
And that's essentially what it is. The gadgets are over the top. The suaveness is over the top. It's basically everything about a James Bond film, but you turn the amplifier up to 11.
Okay.
Right? And you crank it up. So,
I'm sorry. I'm going to stop you right
okay.
there. Movies like the Kingsman, Bond films, and Shannon, if you listen to this, I'm going to give a shout out to you for this one too, because you and I talked about this, because you seem to find it funny from time to time when we watch Bond films together. You can't question anything that happens in a Bond film or the Kingsman.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they are way over the fucking top. How many goddamn times should James Bond actually have been fucking killed?
Well,
shot, at least. At least shot.
Well, I mean, spoiler alert, but in the Kingsman, people actually do get shot in the head and they live. Because the technology's there to save them. But see, this is the thing. But, like, James Bond is over the top. Kingsman was taking James Bond and putting it even farther over the top. And when they did Kingsman, I don't think they ever said, like, I'm pretty sure they basically said as they were making the Kingsman, this is, we're paying homage to James Bond. Like, we're not trying to create a new spy film. We're basically doing our over-the-top take on James Bond. So, then this is where it ties in with what we were talking about before. So, in Kingsman, Galahad was the main agent. He trained Eggsy, and then he died.
Right.
And Eggsy became Galahad. So there was 7 or 8 Kingsmen, and each of them had a name. And when they died, the next one that moved up took their name. So that's what I'm saying with James Bond, right?
You know, that's
James Bond and the 007 thing. When that spy retires or leaves or gets killed or is old or whatever happens, the next one that comes in takes that name.
So now that's also funny that you say that, because one thing that I didn't get to mention when we first brought in these other different things about James Bond and how there can be so many different James Bonds, I am almost certain to myself that there's a couple Roger Moore ones where, like, you know, 003 was found dead with this in his hand. 006 was found dead. Yeah, so how was there 006 in GoldenEye? How was there, 002? And how were all these other 00s in earlier James Bond
You know what?
films?
I'm wondering if maybe that was another thing that the Kingsmen were playing off of when they played off of James Bond was...
Right.
Because they had 7 or 8 agents. And maybe MI6 had 7 agents. And James Bond, being 007, was the top one. And that's why we're following him.
Right.
But when an agent died, the agent that took his place took
We moved
that
up,
code
and
name
then
and that
we could
code
get
number.
Other guys to move up, we've had to bump everybody up. We need a new 003. We need a...
And we're just following the 007.
Right.
Whose code name or field name is James Bond.
Right. Yeah, things like that. There's a couple Bond films where, the bad guy is a former MI6 agent as well, and which makes for interesting character. Bond films in the 60s to the 80s, villains, which we're going to get into, were your basic typical villains bent on world domination, and they were just your average looking Joe Schmo, whatever. And somehow I have this huge fortress, and whatever. When we revamped Bond, villains started becoming more elaborate. If we jump into The World Is Not Enough and go back to Pierce Brosnan, Michael Apted, who had a interesting view of James Bond and a Bond villain, which I actually really love Robert Carlyle's stint as a Bond villain. He plays one that wound up taking a bullet to the head, got shot in the head, but the bullet was never removed, and it moved further and further and further down into his head each time, cutting off his senses of pain, his senses of whatever, but it grew smarter and smarter and stronger every day, and would until this bullet would kill him. So that makes for a very interesting Bond character. Like, how am I gonna do battle with this guy? What can hurt him, what cannot hurt him, different things like that. So kind of great things like that. Kind of same thing as we moved into Daniel Craig and Javier Bardem's portrayal as a Bond villain. Now, Javier Bardem actually met Daniel Craig at the premiere of previous Bond film, and they had kind of joked around about doing a Bond film together, and Daniel Craig actually recommended Javier Bardem to Sam Mendes as bringing him as the villain. Javier Bardem was so excited that he went back and he watched every Bond film leading up to that one, and he said, I want to be a villain unlike any villain that has ever been around before. And that set the writers in new directions. Well, what the fuck can we have this guy do then? And everything, his character was just, I still remember the first time he revealed his full stint of his character. I couldn't believe it. I was mind baffled. I was shocked beyond my wildest dreams. It was the most revolting thing I had ever seen. And just the kind of thought of the story of kind of how it happened too was just absolutely revolting. And his Bond villain was absolutely the most memorable. And his scheme was most memorable as well.
And I mean, you get villains in the Bond movies that are over the top.
Absolutely
and
over the top.
So when you're looking at like parodies or homage, I would call Kingsman more of an homage to James Bond than a parody.
Definitely an homage.
And I liked
when you talk parody,
Samuel L. Jackson's villain
as a villain
because he was more or less a normal guy,
right?
And his plan to take over the world wasn't entirely that far-fetched when you think about it.
No. And
I mean, who wouldn't take a free cell phone with Lifetime free internet if they offered it, right? But I like how he says to Galahad when he comes out and he's like, so this is the part where I tell you all about my plans for everything, and then you somehow escape when I turn my back and you know everything and whatever. And he's like, this ain't that kind of movie. And he just shoots him in the head. And it was like every over-the-top Bond villain. This was a guy who just was not over the top, but at the same time, sense.
But at the same time, as you said, we're paying homage. And take a look at what mistake every single fucking Bond villain made. I've got James Bond right where the fuck I want. I could vaporize your ass right now where you sit. But no, I'm going to talk, and I'm going to tell you my fucking plans for
and then I'm going to set up an elaborate way to kill you, and then I'm going to leave the room and not even watch it happen.
So on that note, if we're going to talk parodies,
this is where I'm going with. We're going to the same place. So Austin Powers. When it was that was a parody, and Dr. Evil, great over the top villain, and he even says it at one point in the film. Like, he tells him his plan, and then he says, he sets him up with an elaborate way to die and leaves the room.
Yeah, with one inept guard to keep an eye on him.
I think he literally said, this one inept guard will,
we'll keep an eye on you or something.
And wasn't that when they wanted the sharks with laser beams, but he got sea bass? So anyway, but was it the third movie, I think, where he has him and Scott Evil just comes in and he's like, I've got a gun in my room. I'll just go get it, and I'll come in here and I'll just kill him. Yeah. I'll shoot him. Why don't we get you a gun? Let's just shoot him.
We'll shoot him together.
We'll do it now. Father, son. We'll do it together.
Yeah.
And that was the great part was everybody around Dr. Evil was a normal, smart, everyday person, and Dr. Evil was just that over the top.
Yeah,
villain.
it's just like, how about no, Scott?
Yeah.
You know, and
I got a big bag of shit for you right here.
right here. Yeah.
Zippy long stock. Anyway, but that really was the ultimate parody on James Bond, and right down to, I mean, what was the second Austin Powers movie? The Spy Who Shagged Me.
Right.
The Spy Who Loved Me.
The Spy Who Loved Me.
Goldmember.
Goldfinger.
And it was a Dutch guy who wanted to turn everything into gold.
Into gold. So,
you know,
also we see things like in The Spy Who Shagged Me, we see when Felicity and Austin...
Felicity Shagwell.
Shagwell. There you go right there.
To go on along with a lot of vagina.
A lot of vagina.
Foxy Cleopatra.
Foxy Cleopatra. Cheesy names with great double entendre meanings.
Was a lot of vagina. Wasn't she one of the Russian spy women though?
In the first one.
Wasn't there a Dixie Normus in there too? Dixie Normus? I want to say there was a character called Dixie Normus. But what was Elizabeth Hurley's character in the first one? What was her... Did she have a clever name too? Because I can't remember.
No. I don't think she does.
I'm going to look it up really quick.
Kensington. She was Miss Kensington's daughter.
So, yeah. But just... Such a good parody. Because it was hilarious.
Austin Powers parodied everything right down to when him and Felicity come out of the water on Dr. Evil's island and they strip out of their wetsuits and Austin Powers has the white bikini on, pays homage to Ursula Andress and the Honey Rider character, and does the whole flings his hair back and the whole 9 yards. And again, they were campy and they were spoofy. Again, like, how many fucking times should Austin Powers have been shot or fucking killed?
Well, exactly, and even right down to the car.
Right,
British flag and
British flag on the car, which certain things like that were paid homage to in certain Bond films as well. Bond films have had a lot of history for the 56 years that they've been going for. Anything from complications with music and just making the film to almost being sued. Going back to Thunderball, the person who originally wrote the story for Thunderball, Kevin McClory, when he submitted his script, producers liked it, but it wasn't really what they were going for and made a lot of changes on it, which McClory did not like, and was in a go to actually sue Eon Productions and the producers of these Bond films because they had changed his script so much and, you know, without really very much prior approval or anything like that. It was settled in the fact that they would bring this McClory guy on as kind of like an executive consultant to help bring Thunderball alive. And on that note, in the early 80s, while Roger Moore was being James Bond, Bond actually kind of veered off a little bit, and a completely different company and studio produced what Thunderball should have actually been in the 80s, and this was called Never Say Never Again. It was still considered a 007 film, but like if you were to buy, say, like the whole entire set together, you would not get this one with the set. You would have to buy it separately. They actually brought Sean Connery back for this in the 80s, with a little bit of revamping, because of course we're bringing back Connery, so he looks obviously his age, and Bond looks a little bit out of shape, and there's references made to that in the film. The exact same story as Thunderball, pretty much, an exact same kind of concept. The only thing I will say that is exceedingly awesome about Never Say Never Again is Kim Basinger makes an exceedingly hot Bond girl. But
Speaking of quote unquote Bond girls, I just remembered Austin Powers in the third movie, the Japanese twins, Fook me and Fook you.
which is again your typical stint of a great double entendre name for girls in an Austin Powers movie / Bond movie / whatever. If we want to go back to
Twins, Basil. Twins.
if we want to go back to Bond, and if we want to go back to, and this is exceedingly racy for even the 70s, by my standards, in The Man with the Golden Gun, there's a point where Bond infiltrates Scaramanga's house, his fortress, and there's, not Scaramanga, sorry, the guy who employs Scaramanga, the Man with the Golden Gun, High Fat, and there's a girl swimming in his pool naked, and Bond says to her, like, how's the water? And she says, why don't you come in and find out? And he says, sounds very tempting, miss. And she says, chew me. And he says, really? And he says, well, there's only one small problem. I have no swimming trunks. And she says, neither do I. But the name Chew Me, and this naked woman swimming in a pool,
It's typical.
yeah. So again, the jokes for the exceedingly high sexual double entendre thrown in with a great name, Bond girl name.
So
In there.
one other thing I did want to get to that we'll touch on just really quick is what people sometimes refer to as the Star Trek effect,
Right.
which is technology and things in a TV show that don't exist that humans then create. Basically, it inspires the scientists to go out and create something like that. And some of the Bond technology, like in with Pierce Brosnan when he's driving the car with his phone.
Right.
I mean, you can't drive your car with your phone, but we are starting to get into an age of self-driving cars, and you can start your car and turn on your lights and your
We can do that
windshield
now from the
wipers and all that
confines of our
stuff
house
with
with my clicker.
your phone,
Just
or even with your phone now.
even with your phone now.
You can do that. There's that new Ford commercial where it's all linked to your phone. You can actually start your vehicle from across the country
Right.
if you felt like doing
If
that.
you felt like doing that.
So I'm just wondering, like, some of the other technologies that
Even small things like, obviously things that were like a big go like in the 90s and so forth, but when we see the very first go of it, like if we go back to From Russia with Love, there's a point where he's making out with a girl, and believe it or not, for 1963, his beeper goes off in his jacket, his suit pocket, and he goes and he pulls this thing out, and it's huge. It's massive. It's like the size of the palm of your hand. It's this huge, clunky beeper. But again, back in 1963, I'm sure that was a very handy device, and it just fit right in the inside of your suit jacket pocket, But, of course, we see beepers today, and they're, what? Yay size, clip on the side of your pants, and
you don't see beepers today. You saw beepers.
you saw beepers
Back in the late 80s, early
kind of
90s.
just like the same concept as like cell phones.
I mean, there might be some drug dealers out there that still use beepers. But cell phones was a big one from Star Trek with the portable communication device and stuff like that. The other thing you mentioned with the car, with the mirrors on it and everything, turn the car invisible.
Right.
They've
Absolutely.
come out now with, I actually just saw this the other day, interactive fabric on clothes, where the clothes can actually change color. Like the fabric can basically do whatever you want it to do, change design, change whatever. And they're looking at things where you have a jacket made of that material. And you could basically have it so the jacket can see what's behind you and mimic that, so the jacket almost becomes invisible. So if you were wearing a suit of this, you'd be invisible, or if your car was covered in it, we're not there yet, but there's
actually not only that, there is actually at one due point in time in a Maxim magazine I wound up seeing that somebody had created a bulletproof suit.
Yeah.
The material was bulletproof. You didn't have a bulletproof vest on underneath.
Just the material.
The material of the suit was bulletproof. I don't know who would want to be the one to test that out, but
Sure, someone who gets paid a lot of money.
But Bond films, in the time, there's even one where a bulletproof vest is tested out.
So I mean, you get some technology there. I mean, it's not machine guns or rockets in cars, but in South Africa, because there's so many carjackings, you can actually have a car that when someone comes up and tries to open the door when you're sitting at a stoplight, it actually shoots fire. Like the whole car basically envelops in the flames,
Right,
and burns the shit out of the person.
We saw that in earlier Bond films, like, say, like, there's a guy that smashes the window to his Lotus in For Your Eyes Only. The whole fucking car blows up.
Yeah.
Takes out, like, 3 or 4 fucking guys. Like, that's it. Like, this guy smashes the window and kablamo! Whole fucking car's gone and vaporized. So kinds of things like that. Even when we go back to things like Thunderball, there's a thing that Q creates for him, which is just a small mini breather for short periods of time underwater. Say, like, 3 or 4 minutes. But even that idea, for the small stint, I mean, again, there's got to be things like that possibly that the Navy possibly uses for small certain things. I mean, just a small meat breather that...
There's, like, smartwatches. That's something that's fairly new.
Absolutely.
But James Bond always, kind of had a watch that could do special things. Like a watch that was connected to a satellite. Technically, your watch now is connected to your phone, which is connected to a satellite. It's kind of interesting with the technology and stuff. So, one last thing before we go. Just curious, and we don't need huge detailed explanations, but I'm going to fire a couple things at you, and just give me like a quick response answer to it. All right?
Fair enough.
Favorite Bond girl?
Favorite Bond girl? My favorite Bond girl, I would have to say, is... I would certainly have to say Honey Rider. I would have to go back to the original Bond and say Ursula Andress. She was the one that set the standard for the Bond girl, and certainly brought what the concept of the sex appeal for a Bond girl should have. Certainly without her, I mean, we wouldn't have had the sex appeal of Pussy Galore or any of the other ones with things to come of how a Bond girl should be perceived. She was also she didn't come across as helpless either. She tried to do her best to stick up for herself and to help Bond the best that she could have. Like, she didn't come across as completely useless. In so many words or less. I'm sorry if that sounds like a sexist statement, ladies and gentlemen. But there were some Bond girls who were floozies and certainly could have done with less whining and maybe more fighting.
I don't think that it is sexist for you to say that you admire a strong, resilient, confident woman.
Thank you.
Thank
you for refabricating my words for me.
Dig up, stupid. Favorite Bond villain?
Favorite Bond villain, to me, would have had to have been Silva. Javier Bardem's go as a villain. He really did bring about anything like a Bond villain that we had never seen before, and it was really kind of the first time with his character that we had seen or really grasped the concept that possibly MI6 was bent. Is Bond really fighting for Queen and Country, or is MI6...
if MI6 has a hidden agenda, is Bond even part of it? Or is he oblivious to it?
Well, exactly. Like for the fact that he makes reference to the fact that even though these guys are paid to do what they do, and their job is to do what it is, like Silva, even at one due point in time, says, I'm nothing more than just a picture on the memorial wall of MI6. I'm forgotten about. Nobody remembers that I was the best at one due point in time. That I was the one that did this, and I was the one that did that. I was the one that created this.
And you know what? That's quite a reflection onto James Bond, too, because someday he could be that.
So I do have to say that, like, in a huge spoiler, his character was betrayed by M, Bond's boss. His character was betrayed in the fact that, like, he was caught up in a sticky situation and he bit into his cyanide capsule to kill himself so that he didn't give away any information, and it just turned out to be hydrogen sulfate, which disintegrated his face. And it came to the point that it had eaten away at his face and his inside so badly that we see in a point that he removes the whole upper inside of his mouth and takes it out. That's what this hydrogen cyanide shit had done to him. That what he was told was in this capsule wasn't what was really in this capsule, and it didn't kill him. All it did was just fuck him up and turn him into this hideous, horrible monster. So right there we see that, it makes us think, is MI6 really what they say they are? Are they as truthful to their agents that save and protect their country as what they really are? And his character brought a lot to the Bond franchise and the Bond story alone.
Favorite Bond car?
Favorite Bond car? I'm going to have to go with the vintage classic Aston Martin DB5 with modifications. It shows up in various Bond films, which also shows up in, somehow, Casino Royale, which again is a prequel. So I don't know how he wound up getting the car. Guess is as good as mine, but
it's just one of those continuity errors.
It is considered the quintessential James Bond car. And the fact that it was the very first one to be souped up totally with fucking gadgets.
Speaking of, favorite Bond gadget?
Favorite Bond gadget? Would have to be, wow. Whew. Favorite Bond gadget? I have to say I actually liked his briefcase that he gotten from Russia with Love. It kind of had everything for a spy that a spy would need. And I like the exploding tear gas cartridge in the case. It made for a little bit of deception and sneakiness. Like, if you open the case the wrong way, sorry, there goes that tear gas cartridge in your face.
James Bond could open it 100 times and he's fine. If somebody else opens it.
Yeah, because you don't notice that small one little movement that he has to make so that tear gas cartridge doesn't explode in your face.
Favorite Bond movie?
Favorite Bond movie? Favorite Bond movie? I take a lot of flack for this from certain people who like James Bond. I like You Only Live Twice, which was the 5th Connery one.
See, that's interesting. I would have thought that you would have said the very first one, Dr. No, or Skyfall.
For Your Eyes Only seems to see the inside of my DVD player a lot more. For some odd reason, I just find it very interesting. Connery has always had a big interest in Japan and the Japanese background, which is where this one mostly takes place. And, learns and trains to become Japanese and a ninja and so forth throughout the film and be able to do whatever. He went on, he's a rather supporter of Japan and the culture and so forth. And I don't know why that one makes my favorite. I always find it the most interesting. For some reason.
All right.
I would just like to do one last thing before we go, and bear with me because I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible. But for you people out there who have found this podcast interesting and find the go of James Bond interesting, if you feel free to start the need to maybe start checking out Bond films, well, here we go, ladies and gentlemen. So you're going to start out with Dr. No, Go To From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, Never Say Never Again, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, License to Kill, GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, Die Another Day, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, Spectre.
You are a fucking nerd. You weren't even you weren't reading anything. Oh my god. Okay, so I think that's gonna do it for today. Do we preview? Do we have an idea what we're doing next? I think we do.
Next podcast for all you comedy fans out there, get ready.
February.
Oh, I am sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Got to back up. For all you people
Don't
out
start
there,
laughing yet.
yeah, don't start laughing yet. Pull out those romance feelings that you have on the inside. Get those bouquet of flowers ready. Get those boxes of chocolate ready for your significant other, because Valentine's Day is right around the corner, and we will be discussing, with maybe a quite substantial debate on chick flicks.
We're going to do romance movies. We're hoping that we're actually going to end up with 3 guests.
3 guests.
For the next one. I think there's going to be 3 of us that are not big fans of romance movies and 2 that are. So we're going to see if those 2 that are can convince the 3 of us who aren't, whether we should bother watching any or not.
But it gives something to think about in this new span of time. So we'll be taking a look at romance movies and chick flicks, their go on mainstream society and culture, and what influence romance movies have on relationships, and from a female-male gender point of view. So hopefully that will be...
I'll give you a sneak preview. I think they set the bar too high and they're very unrealistic. Anyway, so that's going to do it for this one. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. I think our next one, we're probably going to be about 2.5 weeks until we do that. So, check it out. And we hope you enjoyed this little history lesson of James Bond. And we're going to do one final thing before we go. I'm going to ask you a question, and I just want a one-word answer, no explanation, no nothing, just a one-word answer, and we're going to leave the podcast on that. Sean, who is your favorite James Bond?
Favorite James Bond of all time, I am still going to have to stick old school and say Sean Connery.
There you have it, folks. Sean Connery, best James Bond ever.